to try to stave off finger pointing to the extent possible, where folks say, I don't really need to do anything because the problem is this person over here. So forestry is obviously a significant land use, and in particular where it crosses our streams and often headwater streams can have some significant water quality impacts. So we have increased standards that we're holding forestry operations to, and are investing some money in working with them on skidder bridge initiatives. And I know that's something conservation districts have been involved with historically, and we have a line item actually in this year's budget specific to a skidder bridge initiative, so more of that work to come. And then finally, some of the work to restore natural resources. And this is a heck of a picture. This is from Stowe, for folks who aren't around here, of some houses being built what would appear to be perilously close to a river. And indeed it is perilously close. It's not just the photo angle. But to try and in essence, revise our regulations to preclude that kind of development going forward. Some work done to restore and stabilize stream banks, but we realize really the best public policy, the most cost-effective public policy, is to avoid those conflicts in the first place. So we'd rather see those developments placed elsewhere rather than having to work with landowners to stabilize what is obviously an unstable bank. Another piece of this has been some changes in shoreline regulation. Vermont lagged behind many of our neighbors for many years in terms of not having any shoreline regulation requirements. And that changed, I think, in 2014, and now we have some much more significant shoreline management requirements, both in terms of cutting trees, but also in terms of managing stormwater on those sensitive properties. So just a little bit more about the Clean Water Fund, and as you can see, the fund is actually is managed by a board. The board is comprised of 5 agency secretaries, so Vermont secretaries of Natural Resources, Agriculture, Transportation, Commerce and Community Development, and the chair of the board is actually the Secretary of Administration. And so the available funding is brought into the Clean Water Fund and then distributed across the 4 agencies that are responsible for implementation. With that kind of money flowing through our system, it's really important for us to be able to track what we're doing and the results we're achieving. It's important for our accountability to the public, our accountability to the legislature, and our accountability to EPA as the ultimate regulator in this scenario. And so we're developing tools to track not only the projects, but the phosphorus reductions associated with those projects as part of an accountability framework, so that we can make clear these investments are going to achieve our goals, knowing that it's going to take time, that this is a 20-year effort. And so we may not see the kind of changes everyone would like in the first few years. This kind of tracking system can document all of the good things we're doing on the ground as we build to those water quality goals. And we have a lot more information on our website. I would encourage you to visit it if you're interested. Also, this year we're having Clean Water Week, the week of August 20th. And that is for those of you who will be in Vermont. There are more than 35 events that are going to take place during that week. Opportunities to get out and visit a farm and see some practices on the ground, take a tour of a wastewater plant, check out some rain gardens, or perhaps paddle along the section of the Missisquoi River that's been designated as wild and scenic. So if you happen to be here in Vermont, I encourage you to check out one or more of those events, and it should be a good time.
Thank you very much, Julie. So, how can we cover like 10 years in an hour? It's a little challenging here. So, Representative David Deen, we'll start with you, please. Could you please talk about the process of developing and passing the Vermont Clean Water Act? How did the legislature and state agencies collaborate in this process, and how was the public engaged? Any lessons learned you'd like to share?
Well, for those of you who are visiting Vermont, you might not know, but I'm the water guy in the state legislature. and I've been working on water over the 29 years of my career. But in answer to the specific question, one of the things about water is a phrase that economists use, and that is people have a myopic view of water, meaning that it is difficult to see in the present tense what is happening to water quality, because it is so long-term, it stretches out. It's just hard to measure in that immediate sense when, you know, you got to get up at 6 o'clock, get breakfast, get to work, etc. Well, the public view in terms of water changed in water year 2011. 2011 here in Vermont saw the highest water level ever in recorded history of Lake Champlain in May of 103 feet, 103.5 feet. And given the preference for springtime south winds, created havoc in terms of shoreline erosion on the north end of the lake. And of course it got to that level of 103 feet by inflow from a lot of storms that moved huge amounts of sediment, most of which probably carried phosphorus with it down into the lake. That fall, this area of the country had Tropical Storm Irene, and that blasted the Connecticut River watershed, saving enough energy to create further damage in the Champlain watershed. It was really interesting because at that time I was working as the river steward to protect the Connecticut River, and I worked in both Vermont and New Hampshire in that position, and I knew that emergency responders on both sides of the river were ready to go because we knew Tropical Storm Irene was coming. Never hit New Hampshire. They never left the station over in New Hampshire. It got dumped on Vermont. Two gigantic water events all in the same year. So the public response to water suddenly was no longer myopic. There was not a long view on it because their river had moved. Their lake was unswimmable. And it brought together a sense of, we've got to look at what it is we're doing, because it's pretty obvious it's not working. We lost huge amounts of infrastructure to Tropical Storm Irene, a lot of shoreland, and a lot of deposition of sediment in Lake Champlain. Public interest gets expressed through organizations, mostly through organizations when it's a matter of the legislature. We do have public hearings. Lots of people do show up at those. But we get our detailed information from groups like the conservation districts, and Jill was observing and participating through a lot of the conversation. Other members of the county conservation districts were present. Friends of Northern Lake Champlain, group of business, agriculture, citizen, advocate organizations represented within that Friends group. Lake Champlain Farmers Alliance, Trout Unlimited, Conservation Law Foundation, Vermont Natural Resources Council, Lake Champlain International, the Lake Champlain Program, which is a citizens program working in the Champlain Basin, the Agency of Natural Resources, Agriculture, Food and Markets, our Community Development Agency, and then, as I already mentioned, good old Mother Nature had a hand in moving the Clean Water Act from an idea to fruition. Even at that, the Clean Water Act did not pass until 2015. But in the intervening times, as I said, we here in Vermont said, we got to rethink how we're doing this. Our infrastructure did not stand up well. Our personal property loss was extremely high, and even after the river flooding had subsided, we then went ahead and, in response to the flooding, made matters worse by just chewing up the rivers with the big yellow machines. So the legislature is always willing to listen to overwhelming interest on the part of citizens, and 2011 started a series of legislation. In 2012, we passed Act 110, and that bill dealt with the very issue I was talking about. During high water, rivers move. Flooding in Vermont, at least in the mountainous areas, is not inundation. It's not a matter of rising water. It's a matter of the river moving and taking out infrastructure or property. In 2013, we passed Act 138, and it basically brought Vermont into the 21st century relative to the federal emergency management requirements. Our state law was not in compliance. It cost our communities a lot of money, and when we went to try and build to flooding resistant, flooding resilient structures to replace the infrastructure lost in Irene, they wouldn't pay for it because it wasn't the policy of the state, and consequently some towns found themselves hanging out there to dry because the Agency of Natural Resources said, oh yeah, you can replace that culvert, but you have to build to these standards. And those were new standards, and those were flood resilient standards. But in fact, it cost more money to do that, and FEMA was saying, no, we're not going to pay for that extra cost. We're only going to pay for what you had in there. Long story short, a lot of advocacy on the behalf of lots of people in the state of Vermont to make our towns whole. So in 2013, we straightened that out. In 2014, we passed the Shorelands Protection Act, and the Secretary has touched on that. Vermont had no protection at all on our lake shores. You could plow it to the edge after you took off the trees and all of the natural vegetation, and there was no protection at all. We straightened that out in 2014, and that finally led, during all of those intervening years when we were dealing with other legislation, there was a thought that we had to take the final step, and that was to change the required agricultural practices, change the accepted management practices for logging, create a municipal roads general permit so that, in fact, repairs were done with water quality in mind. We created what we call the TS4 permit, which now requires our agency of transportation to get a stormwater permit before they do construction, again, to protect water quality. The MS4 permit, which is a municipal stormwater permit, only affects, I think, 14 communities in Vermont, but we, under the provisions of the Vermont Clean Water Act, this 2015 Act, did in fact broaden out the effectiveness of the standards of the MS4 permit. The 3-acre operation permit that the Secretary has talked about in her remarks, but we also asked that the agency come back to us because there are operating permits for stormwater and there are construction permits for stormwater. Right now, our trigger for a construction permit is 1 acre. We asked the agency to come back with a recommendation on reducing that to 1/2 acre, and we're in the middle of the legislative process to get that adopted. So there's the history. Those of you who haven't lived through it, probably a lot of questions, and I'll be around after the forum if you want to talk about how such a thing could happen in your state. And I'd love to help you do it.
Thank you. Anybody else want to comment on that question, or shall I go on to the next?
I'll just add a little bit from the agricultural perspective, because as farmers do come in and provide testimony, but not that many of them. They don't have the capacity. And so one of the things the agency had done the year prior, because as Julie had mentioned, EPA, we knew the TMDL was going to be rescinded, and we knew that we were going to have to step up as far as change some of the agricultural regulations. So we created what we called the Agricultural Working Group. So it's a group of 24 farmers, and then their technical service providers, which is in Vermont, the people who help write nutrient management plans for the most part. They don't do inspections or design BMPs, but they help with nutrient management plans. And agronomists from UVM Extension. And the districts was also a member of the board or committee. And we spent 2 years talking with them, with a facilitator, to ask, we know that there's going to be new regulations, what seem like the right ones to actually address the problem. And that whole report was actually provided to the legislature, and it's up on the website. The Environmental Mediation Center has a website where all of this stuff is kept. And it's the foundation of the RIPs. We definitely did a little bit more beyond that, but it certainly helped stimulate that conversation that the farmers stepped up and said that there were some things that they wanted. And I would say across the board, what the community in Vermont wanted is the way we were structured was large farms and medium farms were regulated through permits, and everyone else just had to follow these accepted ag practices, now required ag practices, which was a title change, which was a good idea because not everyone knew that they were actually required for so many years. So it really clarified that. But basically it set the foundation for that, and their goal was as the ag community to be equal, right? Treat us the same, have similar requirements. You know, the statement was, my manure is no different than my neighbor's, and the water is no different running through their property, so make it equal. And so that's in the ag world where we sort of started to enter this process.
I guess I'll just add quickly too from, you guys can hear me? The local perspective that, you know, there were a variety of statewide meetings held by the various agencies to reach out to local towns and farmers and individuals, and that those were both well attended and also sort of nicely spread throughout the state. And if a local group organized their own meeting, there were people who would come down from the various agencies and attend those meetings as well. So I did hear a lot of feedback locally that people felt, you know, at least they had an opportunity to attend the meetings, and that was a positive piece of outreach.
The only thing I would add, I think, is important to keep the perspective. Representative Deen did a really nice job sort of laying out that timeline, and it was 4 years of hard work. And the points Laura and Hilary made are important too, with a lot of public outreach component and then some real targeted outreach to individual stakeholders. But this certainly isn't the sort of thing that happened overnight. There was sort of movement in that direction. Tropical Storm Irene and the flooding in Lake Champlain in 2011 certainly accelerated those activities, but it still took a lot of time and effort to get to where we are today.
Thank you. So subsequent to the passage of the Clean Water Act, what have been some of the legislative and rulemaking activities? You've covered a little bit of this already in your summaries, but I just wanted to give you a chance to add anything. Starting with Laura DiPietro of Agency of Agriculture.
So we talked about the REPs, and I want to just mention real briefly, the timing couldn't have been perfect on the federal side. When all of this started happening, not the EPA federal side, the USDA, NRC. But there was significant funding for Lake Champlain that came forth, and there were some opportunities with the Farm Bill to get alternative grant programs moved into Vermont, or throughout the state. And so it helped with the partnership, and it helps that Vermont is so small that we could all meet. There's many of us in this room that have just met many times to try and brainstorm how can we use all the resources everyone has to come up with the right solution. And so that ag work group, for instance, part of the funding that we cobbled together, because this was before we got any water, sustained water funding, which is still not all the way sustained, right? But we started this process on USDA support, really, to get going, and then it just continued from there with opportunities for grants going forth. So that piece, I think, really did help, because we were talking about regulations all the way through the required agricultural practices, but at the same time, always trying to connect that technical resource to allow the farmers to have a place to go. And at this point, you've got record numbers of sign up in the state, which is really indicative of the farmers that are really, they're seeing this and they want to move and make progress. I will share one thing I think for the Agency of Ag's perspective, it started well, right? This ag work group really was engaged and wanted to discuss all this stuff and felt like the ag community, Agency of Ag was reaching out to farmers and farmers were able to be heard. The tables have definitely churned, and we've had some conversations with farmers. At this point, they don't trust us, they feel they're overregulated and sort of that mindset, which is a challenge now as we're going out and trying to implement this stuff. And so, from our perspective, we've tried to dig and think about some self-reflection, what do we do, right? Our own therapy sessions. But the reality is, we spent over 90 meetings talking to farmers about regulations. I think that had a negative impact in some ways. There was a lot of opportunity. We had 3 different sets of rules that we came out with as we listened to people. But the more people spoke and they reiterated their message, it was maybe something we couldn't change, right? Because the law had already been written that said you have to write rules that reflect this. And no pointing at you as you're negative, but like it was just the legislature made one thing and we had to work with that. So that frustration of you're not listening started to come out in that process. And now as we're engaged, we got more staff. And so our staff are going out and doing more visits with farmers, but in a regulatory nature. And so it doesn't feel like before when we would show up, we didn't have the resources, and everybody sort of knew it, to come back and dog you unless you really had big issues. But now we do, and so that presence of the ag leaders being out there, speaking to us, and then seeing us come back the other way, they feel offended, I would say, in many ways. And so it's an interesting piece right now as our agency tries to move forward, because Vermont as a place has always been neighborly and friendly and work together, and it's being challenged, I think, at this point. I think the farmers are stepping up, they're doing the right thing, they're engaged, but as far as having a quality relationship doing that, it's going to take a few years, I think, to repair, which is just something I didn't see coming when we started with the ag work group. I thought we were on a very good trajectory.
Thanks. Oh. Go ahead, David.
I was going to say, as I mentioned, I have been in our citizens' legislature for a long time. And it, over those years, water issues were constantly in front of me and the committees that I either served on or chaired. And at one point, this is somewhat of an overstatement, but not really, you couldn't have the Ag Agency and the Agency of Natural Resources in the same committee room at the same time. I mean, there was that much tension between the organizations.